Real-world computer programming for kids step 29. Dealing with a thrown exception. To catch or to fumble? That is the question. As Shakespeare, or was it Francis Bacon, said, to catch or to fumble? That is the question. In the last step, we solved some problems, but when trying to load a second CSV file, got an error message. And the newsletter shows that error message, a screenshot of it, or scream shot. So put your hunting gear back on as we go out to track down this bug. First, we'll do a desk check to see if we can see what the problem is. Let's look at the code that runs when a file is selected from the combo box, which contains the list of files. That is, the combo box's selected index changed event handler. And it shows that event handler code. So the exception is thrown either in the populate list method or in the update the form method. One thing we can do to determine which method contains the problem code is to update the exception message they show. Go to the populate list method and change this line in the catch block. And it shows the line to change, and it shows what to change it to. Do the same thing with the update the form method, with the exception, no pun intended, of course, of having it read from the update the form method rather than from the populate list method. You can see that now, instead of just seeing exceptions message, we also see its inner exception, stack trace, and source. The exception message we see will tell us which method threw the exception, and those extra properties of the exception object, inner exception, stack trace, and source that we are now displaying will help us too. Now run the code to the end and select the other CSV file from the combo box. Programmingquestions.csv. What do we see then? An exception is thrown, and that is shown in the newsletter. Dismiss the message box and press Shift plus F5 to stop the app. You see, that gave us a lot more information. There was nothing in inner exception and nothing of much value to us this time in source, but stack trace is a boon to us. It tells us not only which method threw the exception, update the form, but even which line it was on. 170. So we look at our code to see what line 170 is. The part of the code that contains line 170 is the one italicized below. It must be the case then that MCC list does not have a multiple choice class in the index location that equates to the value of the multiple choice class index variable. The code is asking for a value that does not exist, or trying to access a value that does not exist. So this is the line where the exception is thrown, but that doesn't mean this line of code itself is the problem. The actual failure could appear earlier, but only show up now. You might compare it to falling off your bicycle and hitting your head. Was the falling off the root of the problem, or was neglecting to wear a helmet the problem? We could put a breakpoint on line 170 and see what the value of multiple choice class is when we get there. But my guess is that the file we selected is not being loaded into MCC list for some reason, and therefore it is completely empty, and that's why once an attempt is made to access its values, an exception is thrown. So let's see what's happening at the place in the code where the file should be loaded and then MCC list populated with its contents within the populate list method. The key part of that code is, and then it shows the code in the newsletter. We will step through this code to see what happens with MCC list. Is it cleared as expected? And whether file string array is populated as expected. What should be happening is this. The file selected should be assigned to the selected file string variable. Since MCC list should not be null because we created it earlier with the first CSV file, the MCC list.clear part of the code should run. Then, selected file is read into file string array, and the for each loop should begin. And In the last line shown above, start populating the multiple choice class instance with values. Something there must be failing, otherwise the code wouldn't blow up on line 170. So I'll put the breakpoint on the first line, 74, in the code snippet above, this one. And it shows the line of code where the file selected is assigned to the selected file variable. It worked fine through one pass through the for each loop. Then it went sideways again, and it shows an image of a house that's turned over sideways. I will now put the breakpoint on the for each there, and I show the for each line where the breakpoint is going to see if the second pass through causes a problem. Nope, everything seems fine there. So I will go back to the update the form method after all as the place to set the breakpoint on this line, where the label question text is assigned the value of the question from the MCC list at the multiple choice class index. The key thing will be to note what the value of multiple choice class index is at that point, because that is doubtless the index that the exception message says is wrong, either negative or beyond the bounds of what should be contained as a valid index value in MCC list, namely 0 to 9 inclusive for questions 1 to 10. I do that and run it again. The value of multiple choice class index at that spot is 10. And it shows the exception message. 10 is indeed out of bounds in this scenario. Thus, the thrown exception occurs. Obviously, perhaps the value of multiple choice class index kept advancing or incrementing even after selecting another file, rather than being set back to 0 to start fresh with the new file. And when it was incremented from 9, which accessed the final question, number 10 of the first file, to 10, which would be question 11 of the second file, which does not exist, the die was cast, the fall was taken, and the helmet we put on saved us from what could have been an even worse fate. The helmet, in this case, being the catching of the exception, and thus receiving a clue as to where the problem was occurring. So let's see where multiple choice class index is assigned to in our code. It starts off at -1, is assigned 0 later, and incremented thereafter, but never set back to 0. So that was the oversight that caused the problem. Not setting multiple choice class index back to 0 when a new file is loaded. If you recall, there is an initialize form method that is called from populate list to set some values back to their starting point. Actually, even if you don't recall it, there is such a method at any rate. So we will update that method to now be, and then it shows that code with multiple choice class index set back to its original value of -1. And voila! Except, no pun intended, for one thing. Can you see what the problem is now? And the screenshot is shown of how it now looks. Yes, my eagle-eyed fellow journeyers, or journeyists, whatever. The question N of N label reads question 11 of 10, and the percentage label is stuck on its previous verbiage. That makes no sense. It's wrong, it's a lie, it's tacky. We must fix it. Perhaps this too has the same root cause as the previous bug. It could be that there are more variables that need to be reset back to their starting values. In fact, updating the method to this, and it shows the method with 2 new things. Questions answered is set to 0, and correct answers is set to 0. And that solved the problem. As you can see, questions answered and correct answers are now set back to 0. So our app is now working. It's not perfect, but we will add a few more niceties to it later. But we will take a little bit of a break in the next step, where I will show you how you can create your own lists of questions and candidate answers and add them to this app, providing an example of CSV files that contain both less than 10 and more than 10 sets of questions and answers. just to show you that our app can handle any number of questions and answers, not just 10. Until then,